Good morning. Welcome to EER's webinar on radicalization trends for 2021. The last year has obviously been a testing one, and with the coronavirus and the lockdowns, there's been a spread of conspiracy theories and other radical ideologies. We saw an example of how misinformation works with the attack on the Capitol in January, and we thought that it was timely to assess how these trends are going across Europe and indeed across the world. So we've gathered two experts to assess this with us. I'm going to hand over first to Dr. Tommaso Virgili, a postdoctoral fellow at the Berlin Social Science Center and a research associate at Wilfried Martens Centre, for European studies. He studies liberal trends in Islam and in the general challenge of Islamism in Europe and in the Middle East. And our second speaker, who I'll hand over to in a moment, will be Sami Moubayed, a Syrian historian and the founder of the Damascus History Foundation, whose book is Under the Black Flag about the Islamic State, and we shall hear from him in due course. So Tommaso, if you want to take 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. And I want to start this by recalling the mantra that circulated in Italy at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, or say better, when we realized that it was not a racist conspiracy, but it was a real emergency. The mantra was, we will come out of it better people. Well, out of it we are not yet, but worse people we are already, I think. And we are witnessing an unprecedented polarization. The events in the US were clearly like an evident example of that. I think in my life I would never think of witnessing an assault at Capitol Hill, a president inciting a coup in the United States. And this polarization in the US was already there before. On the one hand, you had the white supremacists demonstrating with rifles in favor of the Boogaloo, the race war. On the other hand, you have, and you still have the Antifa and Black Lives Matter protesters that have destroyed buildings, militarily occupied parts of cities. Of course, not all of them, but a radical fringe of these movements, and we have seen that in Seattle and Portland. In some cases, we have even seen the two extremist groups together, as happened in Richmond in July, as a further demonstration of how radical movements have more in common than things that divide them. European radicalization knows very well. Well, now, the roots of this polarization are distant, of course, but for sure we can say that the pandemic has exacerbated social discontent and has created a fertile ground for further chaos, as demonstrated, for example, in Texas by those militia that defended with weapons the shop owners that were opening their activities in violation of the lockdown. Now, is Europe going better? Apparently, yes, but I would say no, although for different reasons. I would like to bring to your attention an article from the Financial Times, a recent one by Camilla Cavendish, who was former head of the Downing Street Policy Unit and Harvard Senior Fellow, in which she highlights what are the potential consequences of the lockdown measures when it comes to social peace and to the rule of law. So she reports data from the Freedom House showing that around 80 countries have used COVID as an excuse to curb human rights. And of course, she mentioned the example of Viktor Orban, that at the beginning of this pandemic, basically limited the powers of the parliament for an unlimited period of time. Then this was revoked subsequently by the parliament, but this was very worrying when it happened. Cavendish, however, highlights a further point, that these kind of issues do not concern only dictatorship or wannabe dictatorships. Even the UK, the Western democracy par excellence, is not immune. And there are several articles issued by prestigious universities such as Oxford and LSE that focus on the Coronavirus Act 2020 and show the worrying trends when it comes to the rule of law. To mention a few examples, the police who is allowed to arrest those that are potentially infectious without a magistrate authorization, or the fact that for 2 years elections and freedom of manifestations are suspended. So the article concludes by saying that there are indeed risks to the rule of law and also risks when it comes to critical thinking, because we are now in a situation in which any criticism to this trend is perceived as a destructory attempt to curb the fight against the coronavirus. We must say that this is not something that happens in the UK only. Throughout Europe, it is more or less the same. In Italy, we had several jurists, even former presidents of the Constitutional Court, that have claimed that the measures adopted violated the Constitution. Besides the instrument that was taken, which was an administrative instrument, so with a violation of the procedure, most likely foreseen by the Constitution. We had in Italy, as you perhaps know, a situation where citizens were not allowed to leave their own homes unless for a set of specific reasons foreseen by the government. And this is still the situation in certain areas where the rate of infection reaches a certain amount. Well, these, according to many jurists, is not merely a violation of freedom of movement, which can be restrained for emergency situation, but is alike to house arrest, which means a violation of personal freedom that can be only implemented through a judge order. There are other worrying examples that I've seen recently. Something that shocked me very much was last month, a proposal coming from certain German states, whereby those who violate the quarantine should be put in detention centers. Now, this, of course, is not possible in an administrative way, although someone proposed that. Basically, a mayor decides that you violate the quarantine and therefore your personal freedom is restrained. It still requires the authorization of the judge, but still it testifies a trend which is worrying and probably is not corrected by necessity, because the Deutsche Welle was highlighting the fact that less than 30 people have been convicted in the last 9 months for violating the quarantine in the entire country. So probably necessity is not there. The courts around Europe have sometimes stricken down certain measures insofar they violated the constitutions. This has happened in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain. And most recently, it happened, as you probably have seen, in the Netherlands, where a Dutch court ruled that the curfew was illegitimate because it lacked the legal basis and the necessity. So I want to quote the reply of the Prime Minister from Politico, because I think it's quite appalling, at least to me. Prime Minister Mark Rutte said that he believed that the government had a strong case for appeal. If the curfew would have not had the right legal basis at the moment, it does not mean that it's not necessary. Now, I think this declaration is of utmost gravity, because we have the Prime Minister of a democratic country that says, yes, perhaps you're right, I had no legal basis to impose a measure so restrictive of personal freedoms that had not been taken since the Second World War. But still, in my view, it's necessary, without giving the grounds for this necessity. We have seen something similar in Belgium. Actually, just yesterday, there were two organizations, human rights organizations, human rights leagues, both from the Flemish-speaking part and from the French-speaking part, that have filed an appeal against the government due to the measures taken during these emergency times. And especially they have criticized the attitude of the parliament in not keeping the government in check, something that we have seen in the UK as well, in Italy as well. It's a common trend. And here we have another interesting reply from authority. First of all, the government justification is that within 3 weeks, we might have the British variant, so we need to be cautious. This was his answer, facing criticism of rule of law violation. Now, I will come back to this argument that within X time, we might have the variant. But also the president of the Chamber of Deputies gave a very interesting reply to this lawsuit, and she said, yes, at this moment, actually, there is no law that sustains these measures. So the president of the parliament recognizes that there is no effective legal basis for taking measures restricting of the rule of law and personal freedoms as we have not seen since the Second World War. Now, in international law and in the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, we have basically 3 means of restricting personal freedom. The legal provision, 3 requisites, sorry, for restricting certain personal freedoms, not all of them. The measures must be provided by the law, they must be necessary, and they must be proportional. And for this reason, the Council of Europe has released a toolkit for member states on the rule of law during COVID, specifying that even in an emergency situation, the rule of law must prevail, that the measures must be temporary, and they must observe the principles of necessity and proportionality. And they say in an explicit way, COVID doesn't give a carte blanche to governments to do as they please. But what Cavendish, as others, and I joined this group, evidences is the fact that governments, they are in such a situation that they don't even seem to feel the need to give any justification whatsoever for the measures they take. And they even treat those criticizing those measures as either silly or immoral in a way. I don't know if you have seen a recent radio show with Majid Nawaz, that you will know as the founder of Quilliam, and is also one of the most vocal critics of the lockdowns. He was asking to an epidemiologist, who also happens to be an advisor to the British government, if they had made a study on the consequences on human lives of the lockdowns, compared and contrasted with studies on the consequences of not having a lockdown. And the answer was incredible, because this epidemiologist, Gabriel Skelly, said that this was a stupid question. And apparently the question was not so stupid, because after a few weeks, the Times revealed the existence of a secret report, and I'm quoting the Times, commissioned by the British government on the consequences of the lockdown, which, as you can understand, are not positive and are not lethal. There are scientists that argue that lockdowns were not the better strategy. The Great Barrington Declaration from scientists from Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford, that then signed by other scientists all around the world, is an example. I also happened to view a recent Stanford article that comparing a few countries, including the UK, Iran, South Korea, Sweden, France, Germany, and Italy, found no significant effects of lockdowns on curbing the pandemic. But I would like to stress something here. I'm no scientist. I don't have the epistemological means to understand whether these studies have strong legal grounds or not, although at least they come from authoritative sources. But what I can have a say on is the political and legal response to this lockdown, and especially on the requisites that I was highlighting, necessity and proportionality. A few days ago, German Health Minister Spahn said that the goal for Germany is to prevent the health system from being overburdened and not to avoid every infection. to get down to 0 infections and keep it that way comes at disproportionate cost in other areas of life. And this, in fact, was the initial rationale of measures against coronavirus. I'm Italian. I was in Italy when the pandemic erupted, and we were really in a situation where hospitals were exploding. Intensive care units were full at 90%. We were seeing graves transported by the army in the streets of cities. So that was clearly an emergency situation. And there was the initial rationale for imposing lockdowns. But then it's as if the threshold moved constantly a little bit further. It shifted at some point at the infection rate. So irrespective of the situation in hospitals, we link lockdowns to the infection rate. And now, as I was saying before, it's not even the actual present infection rate, but the possibility of a future wave of infection due to the variants. So what I believe is that all of this creates a dangerous situation, dangerous for the rule of law, and dangerous for social polarization and social unrest. This is already apparent in the politicization of science, which is never a good sign. You have scientists that align with party lines more than with actual data. And I remember an article from The Guardian, which is not exactly the far-right avant-garde, that was criticizing the American left, and especially certain health experts who, until the days before, were treating people taken to the streets to protest lockdown measures or even to deny the existence of the virus as potential killers. And the next day, when the Black Lives Matter protests started, they said, and here again I quote, that the health risk of not protesting for an end to systemic racism greatly exceeds the harms of the virus. This is an argument that one can agree on or not, but clearly it's not a scientific argument, because the virus is spread exactly the same way, irrespective of the motivations of the people gathering, but it's clearly a political argument. On the other hand, you have the conspiracy theorists with all their idiocy. It's all Soros, it's all Bill Gates, it's all 5G, virus is fake, and all the things that we have heard even too much. So we have this polarization, which comes with an economic crisis that is unprecedented, and it comes with very severe restrictions of freedoms. This is an explosive mixture because both panem and circenses are taken away, and when this happens, we are never in a good place. So I think that the future in this moment doesn't look bright unless we take a different course in reacting to these epidemics.
Thank you, Tommaso. Sami, if we can hand over to you.
Yes, sir.
Good morning.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes. Okay. Now let me get a video. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for a very informative presentation. I'm going to be speaking about something rather different in terms of radicalization for 2021. I'm going to be looking at this region where I am based. I'm currently in Damascus, and contrary to what many have believed, radicalization is not decreasing with the early entry of the early weeks of the Biden administration. We're seeing a very sharp peak in rhetoric by Iran, by Hezbollah, who embody the Shiite radicalization in the area, and by groups like ISIS and armed Syrian opposition in Idlib, embodying the Sunni hardline groups. So we need to look, first of all, at why we are here and what we can do to improve the situation and combat, we cannot eradicate, but combat or at least reduce this radicalization on both fronts. Now, I'll first look into the Shiite radicalization. I think we had the past 6 months have been months of waiting for the Shiite parties, whether it's the Sadrists in Iraq or Hezbollah in Lebanon, all have been waiting to see who's going to enter the White House, if it was going to be Biden, whether the nuclear deal was going to be revisited. And that explains why they've been very, let's say, not very, but they have had a low profile to a certain extent. And their rhetoric has been somewhat controlled. That has no longer been the case. In Lebanon recently, we just had a huge event, which is the assassination of Luqman Salim, who is a Shiite activist who is critical of Hezbollah. Now, the party is denying that it had anything to do with the murder, saying that it would be like shooting oneself in the foot. But that's what they always do. Now, according to most people who are very well versed in Hezbollah affairs, they had a serious problem with Luqman Salim because he was a member of their own constituency, crying foul play, saying that mistakes were being made and a break from Iran was needed, and a de-radicalization of the and a demilitarization of the Shiite street was required. So what happened? He was shot, and it was a secret message or to all Lebanese, but specifically to Shiite Lebanese, that this is the fate that you will have if you continue to criticize us or refuse to abide by the dictates of Iran. And this is a very worrying state. It's showing a lot of lenience on many issues. It has now taken a more radical stance. One of the less covered topics in the media is it forcing the Lebanese delegation at the maritime talks with Israel to change the disputed area. You know, those talks started a couple of months ago on the basis of a disputed area of 860 kilometers squared in Lebanon's EEZ, exclusive economic zone. Hezbollah has jumped on those talks and changed that area from 860 to 2,290 square kilometers. These positions aim at doing one thing. They aim at telling the world that we will give in neither to the West nor to our partners in Lebanon or to our opponents like the Sunnis and other regional and local players. In Sunni politics, we've got the same thing happening, but on a different scale. As I wrote very recently for EER, on one front, we've got the Muslim Brotherhood regrouping and rebranding itself after its systematic fall in Jordan, which was the only country in the region where they were tolerated and allowed to work. They were banned last June. And we've got the more radicalized groups like ISIS and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which have been regrouping clearly, launching rather impressive attacks whether on the secular armed Syrian opposition or on the Syrian army or on the Russians. Why is that? Well, part of the problem is that all sides feel that the Americans are not there. The Iranians under clear agreement coming out of the Biden team before they came into office as a sign of weakness. Biden gave 2 concessions to Iran by lifting the restrictions on on the travel of Iranian diplomats by saying that they won't be going for international sanctions on Iran. And the result was a much tougher, much less conciliatory position from the Iranians and from Hezbollah at a sub-level. In Sunni politics, again, the American position is being understood as weakness. Now, we've got indicators coming out of the United States that the Americans do not hold the Kurdish issue as a priority, despite all that was said under administration. We had a Pentagon official saying that the oil in Syria was not under the protection of the Americans, and now we've got leaks coming out of the US that the Americans are going to terminate the contract that was given to a Delaware-based company to repair the oil fields, which were under the control of the Kurds. These two positions, worrying as they are to the Kurds, should have given Erdogan enough reason to moderate his positions, to, let's say, rationalize his ambitions, speak a language that is more acceptable to the incoming Biden administration, which is effectively giving him something on a golden platter, a partial distancing of American foreign policy from embracement of the Kurds. The Kurds had relied almost fully on the Americans for the entire notion of their political existence. Pretty much like Iran, Erdogan got the wrong message. Instead of toning down, he's now considering a military operation into Malkiye, an area where the oil fields were not under the control of Delta. He's considering another invasion of Syria to take over Tel Rifat, north of Aleppo. He has done nothing, absolutely nothing, despite all promises that were given to the Russians at cleaning the area of Idlib from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Neither side is really fearing an American response. They feel that there is a lack of lack of hands-on interest for the Americans in the area. The messages that came across through the appointment of someone like Robert Malley, who I think will be perfect for the job, again, was viewed as weakness by the Iranians. How do we control that? Well, one way is to realize that by criticizing a country like Iran and by carrying a big stick, like Teddy Roosevelt used to say, is not going to get it to change its policies. That's been clear from the example we had with Syria. All the pressure that was applied on Syria for behavior change or a detachment from Iran actually did nothing. We also have the more recent experience between Syria and the US. Again, there have been indicators that the Americans are pushing a new policy towards Syria, one more based on diplomacy, given that neither sanctions nor arming the opposition has succeeded. Instead of getting a new stance from the Syrians, they've been cuddling up more closely to Iran. What do you do about that? Well, first of all, you need to start looking for moderates within the constituencies that Erdogan and the Iranians control. Combating radicalization with secularism will not work. It never has. You need to look for Shiite figures, not like Luqman Salim, because Luqman Salim, by the way, he had a very small following, with a tiny, microscopic within the Shiite community, which was incapable of growing because of his secularism. So you need to look at people who don't necessarily look like you. Luqman Salim was westernized, was secular, spoke a language that the West could understand, but that wasn't good enough. We had him killed, and we had very little tears shed. So can you find a Shiite cleric or a Shiite religious authority. He doesn't have to be a critic of Hezbollah, because if you prop up someone who's a critical of Hezbollah, he would immediately be accused of being an agent of the United States and on CIA payroll. You need to start searching for people within the community to start spreading key messages and appealing to the sanity of people, saying, look around. What has this reliance on Iran got you in? Look at the economic situation of the country. Look at the completely crippled political system because of the position that Hezbollah has got itself into. On the other side, this can also be repeated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They had the potential of coming across as a moderate group when compared to Al-Qaeda and HTS. They failed. They failed at doing that because none of their patrons were giving them good advice. Instead of saying, now is a golden moment for you to revamp and rebuild your reputations in light of what was happening in the Arab world 10 years ago, patrons like Erdogan pushed them to demand more, to radicalize more aggressively, and to show a very tough stance, thinking that this would help. It destroyed these parties, and it really destroyed their constituencies as well. So we need to identify these problems. We need to sit down and look at what's been done over the past 4 years under Trump. Has it succeeded? Definitely not. Radicalization is not on the demise, neither with the Sunnis nor with the Shiites. And we need to also come to a hard reality check that Iran is going nowhere, and nice talk to Iran has not led to anything. Erdogan is going nowhere. Appeasing him has also led to nothing. We need to start working in reverse, start to enter into the radicalized communities from below, try to reach their mosque preachers, their writers, their intellectuals, their community leaders, not to challenge Erdogan or Iran, because that would fail, but to push for small breakthroughs here and there that ultimately can influence the psyche of a broader segment of the community. Now, I'll leave it at that, hoping now to, if you want to engage in a Q&A, to see if we can answer any questions that people may have.
Thanks very much, Sami. I think you'll know at the bottom of the screen, there should be a feature to raise hands, and I can get to questions from that. I will turn over to people who want to ask questions. I guess the first one I would ask to Sami in terms of radicalization. Obviously, the initial agreement that the Turks made with the Russians over Idlib, it involves HTS being eliminated from the province, and that has not worked. I don't even think you could really say that it's been tried. Basically, what do you think should be done about that? I mean, is HTS important enough that an effort should be made to put together a coalition to get rid of it, or should its existence be accepted along the lines of Hezbollah in Lebanon? How would you proceed?
Good question. Let me tell you something. HTS is very important, and it cannot be it cannot be eliminated with an international coalition, as we just said. Because unlike ISIS, which were foreigners fighting in Syria, HTS is almost entirely Syrian, if not entirely. And you just can't uproot them. You can kill X, Y, and Z, but the ideology is still there, and they are very strongly entrenched within their community. If you look at ISIS, ISIS is re-emerging in Iraq because its power base was Iraqi, and its fighters were Iraqi, and its origins were Iraqi. But it's literally finished in Syria, because the Syrian contingent of ISIS was never as strong and never as deep-rooted. And the Syria experience relied more on Iraqis and foreign jihadis than Syrians themselves. HTS is Syrian, and HTS is an ideology more than anything else. What you can do is try to promote an alternate ideology. And the only alternate ideology to Salafism is Sufism, by the way. But it speaks of Islam, it refers to the Quran, but it has a very more stricter interpretation of when you can go to jihad and who can be a caliph and what are the rules for excommunication. And that explains, by the way, why when ISIS stormed Al-Mayadeen on the Euphrates River, their first targets were not the seculars and not the Christians, but the Sufis. Now, promoting Sufism within a radicalized community is easier said than done, because the real Sufi clerics have been crushed because of their independence over the last 60 years of military rule. Those who are around now are creations of the security services who aren't really influential within the Sunni Muslim street. But that would be a good idea. And another good idea would be which what Erdogan has been doing recently, he's been encouraging defections from ISIS. Now, he was supposed to cleanse Idlib from HTS, according to an agreement reached between him and Putin in September 2018. He didn't do it. He couldn't send troops into a confrontation with HTS, and he couldn't afford to lose many of his Syrian proxies in such a confrontation. So what he's been doing is encouraging defectors to split from HTS and to fight HTS from within, which is the experience that we've seen recently with a group called Harras al-Din. Is this sustainable? And for how long can it last? And will it lead to eradication of radicalization group of jihadis? So it started out as a good idea, but if you don't follow it up with something concrete, it's going to lead to nowhere, unfortunately.
I see what you mean. I think we have a question in the chat. So somebody was asking, I'll maybe turn this over to Tommaso and then come back to Sami to see about this, about the emergence of Clubhouse, this new social media site, and where we think this is going to go. As previous social media sites obviously have been vectors for extremism and radicalism. Do we think this new one will be any different?
I honestly don't know anything about that. I hear it now for the first time.
That makes sense. Do you have any view on this, Sami?
You know, it's funny you asked, because I was just telling my wife this morning that I've been reading so much about Clubhouse, and it got me intrigued. I personally don't want yet another application on my phone to distract me from what I think is more important issues. But I've been hearing a lot about Clubhouse, and I plan on creating an account out of sheer curiosity. I've heard that it's interesting. You create chat rooms where you talk, you don't type, which is another problem for me, because I think we're creating a generation that first of all, they stopped handwriting and began typing. Then we stopped typing on computers and we started typing on smartphones. Then we went to shorthand. Then we went to voice notes, and now to chat rooms. So a generation is going to emerge who can barely type an ABC on a keyboard, let alone write it in their own handwriting. But that's the limit of what I know about Clubhouse. So I don't know if that's been very helpful.
No, that's It's more than I knew about it, so that's where we go. I was going to ask, Tommaso, you mentioned that you think this, in some sense, we're already worse off, despite the pandemic not being over yet. Do you see any optimistic threads in all of this? Or more precisely, what are the optimistic threads, and do you think any of them have a chance of succeeding?
Well, socially, no. I can reply, of course, from a medical point of view, which is the vaccine. The implementation of the vaccine. It will be very interesting to see now in Israel how it will go as the first country that has reached a consistent level of vaccination within the country. But Israel, now I'm not really answering your question, but Israel is another interesting case for a different reason, because you had a group of religious people, mostly Orthodox Jews, as well as certain Arab communities, that were completely impermeable to the anti-lockdown measures. And this is also a social factor that we have to take into account. We have seen it can be the extreme right in the US, it can be the Orthodox Jews in Israel, it can be the negation theories in Europe. You can see that the state and the rule of law is failing at another level. Like, it's not able to impose the same level of measures on all citizens on the basis of the principle of equality. Because when you have a differentiated treatment of certain groups, it's never a good sign. So I think the only positive sign that I can see is to go out of these pandemics through the use of vaccinations. What I would also like to see is Europe aligning with the US and with the Biden administration regarding the China topic. I'm seeing worrying trends from this perspective, because especially Germany has has pushed for a big deal between Europe and China on investments, despite the incoming new American administration, despite the fact that independent media, including the New York Times, have judged the investigation over the origin of COVID as pretty much piloted by China authorities, despite the fact that of the Uyghurs genocide, I think just today or yesterday, the Canadian Parliament called it a genocide. So what I would like to see is really the West being back together and upholding both its values and its interests, which cannot be the simple nationalistic and very small, petty economic interests.
Thank you. I think that leads very nicely onto the China question in general, which is probably, if I turn this over to Sami, but China's role in the Middle East is quite, it's minimal, at least in the discourse. Their footprint is largely economic, and they've been quite careful to stay out of the political disputes. But they are increasingly evident, especially in certain areas of the Levant. The Uyghur genocide is obviously attracting a lot of attention from jihadists. They're using it to recruit and things like this. Do you think as China's role grows in the area, that we will see that? How do you think it will affect the radicalism trends among the jihadists and other groups? Sorry, I think you're on mute, Sami.
You are muted. We cannot hear you.
Hello. Hello.
Hello, I can hear you now.
Yes, I don't know what happened. You left me or I left you. So where was I cut off?
Sorry, I was asking about the impact of China on the region.
Yes.
So the
Yeah. So I was saying that the influence has been political in addition to economic. It's been because of the veto that they used at the United Nations, but it's been very cautious. The Chinese have refused to thrust themselves into the region as aggressively as Turkey or Russia because of the political instability. At this stage, their priority is combating the Uyghurs, gathering information, tracking down leading figures, preventing fighters from entering China or radicalizing or contacting members of the Muslim community there. At this stage, this is the security concern is the only real concern for China. Despite the rhetoric that you hear about them wanting to invest here and wanting to invest there, they're not going to do it before there's a deal that restores stability to the Levant. Look at this.
sorry, we've lost you.
They've welcomed Walid that's as not investing a penny. They say anything, and so long as their concern is purely security and purely related to jihadism, then it's going to continue fueling radicalization, both at home, in their own home base, and in this part of the world where there are many foreign jihadis still around, particularly in the Al-Hol camp, in the Kurdish areas. That entire portfolio has not been closed. It's still it's a case and a wound that remains wide open.
Thank you. Same question really to Tommaso, but for Europe is how do you see China's interaction with the continent affecting these things? There's obviously been a how would you say there's been a reaction to China over the virus. Some of it's taken a sensible form, some less so.
Well,
what would you say going
no,
forward?
I would say actually no, in the sense that at the beginning there were some very practical reactions, both from states and also for private companies to relocate certain industries, for example, the pharmaceutical sectors, and also some technological factories, to relocate them outside of China for very practical reasons. Like we could see that we could not really trust the handling of this kind of emergency situation by China. But nevertheless, after this initial practical reaction, we had Hong Kong. We had the refusal by China to accept any kind of independent investigation over the origin of coronavirus. The attempt of China to put the blame on other countries. Italy was one of them, actually. At some point, China said, "Oh, the virus was spreading in Italy before than in China, so you should look at Italy as the spreader of coronavirus." And Europe's answer was pathetic, because when Australia and the United States were heavily pushing for a reaction against China for an independent investigation, a reaction against the Hong Kong takeover, what has been called the Anschluss of Hong Kong by someone. Europe didn't have a common position. Europe even accepted in its official documents at the level of the European External Action Service to mild its position towards China under heavy diplomatic pressure. I remind you that Italy, for example, is a part of the new Silk Road project, this idea of investment by China in Europe. Again, I mentioned the new European agreement, EU-China agreement on investments that completely obliterated the issue not only of the Uyghurs, but even of workers' rights in China. So, I mean, for a while we thought that it might be because of Trump. Europe didn't want to align to a mercurial president that was just following the instinct of the moment and also the low instincts of his constituency. But now that we have Biden that is asking the same things when it comes to China, we see that the reaction is very disappointing when it comes to a common European position reacting against this adversary, which is, I don't want to call it enemy, but for sure, and I'm using European Union terminology, it's a strategic adversary of Europe.
Thank you. I think we're just going to wrap this up a moment now. I just wanted to give you each a minute or so to just any final thoughts. So, Sami, if you want to wrap up.
I think we said it all, because what we have at this stage are many questions and concerns. But no real answers. We have ways in which we can experiment, and we can try to combat this radicalization, but so intertwined with really so many other issues, and some of them some of them international, that it's very difficult to predict how these trends will grow and whether they will have a life of their own to assess. But until now, these are just thoughts that we just put out in the open, waiting to see how they can be developed. And thank you for having me. I hope full and not boring.
No, not at all. Thanks for being here. Tommaso, if you wanted to, do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, I think if there is a common thread of what I said, is that the EU as an institution and European states have the tendency to abuse normative concepts, principles, values, human rights in policy documents, and then to make little use of them when it comes to the practical reality of things, both internally and in geopolitics. And this is very sad, because I believe in Europe as a normative project, not only as an economic alliance. And therefore, I really do hope that this dimension is brought again to the fora of internal, domestic, and foreign policy of European states and institutions.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing.
I hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.